Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by Red Thread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Welcome to Workplace Stories. I'm Danny Johnson.
And I'm Stacia Gar.
And today we had the opportunity to talk to Manuel Smukalla, who is the Global Talent Impact, Skills Intelligence, and Systems Lead at Bayer. Bayer has recently been through some pretty tough times and also some pretty massive changes, especially where people structure is concerned internally. And it was a great conversation. Stacia, what stood out to you?
This one was just chock full of so much. It's a culture change, it's a leadership change, it's a way we do work change, it's skills, it's like all the things. So it's in some ways really challenging to pick out just one. But I know you're going to talk about kind of this broader new approach, this DSO approach, but a couple of things I want to specifically mention. The first is that they've changed how they think about jobs. You know, we kind of have talked about this tension between almost like consultant-ish jobs and fixed jobs, and they have both of those, meaning that with consultants, they move from project to project, you know, on some sort of fixed timeline. For them, it's 90 days. The more fixed jobs where somebody has a primary role, but then they've also got this concept of flex jobs, which is where you do a percentage of what you would maybe consider your primary role. And then you may have a couple of other projects that are added on to that. And those projects, as opposed to them being, you know, quote, off the side of your desk or things that your manager just hands down to you, those are things you can find yourself. And that's like built into the structure in this set of expectations. So I thought that was a really cool and interesting articulation of what many folks are living already, but being able to say, this is what it is, and here's how we're going to respond to it. So that was thing number one. Thing number two was this is all a huge leadership and culture change that they have been going through. And leadership being a really critical part of it. One of the big things that jumped out to me when he was talking about that was they actually have a new leadership model. And that leadership model is VACC, which stands for Visionaries, Architects, Catalysts, and Coach. I'll let him talk all about it, but it is not generic. Like, it is very specific to what they are trying to do and what they expect leaders to do, and is a very different way of leading than what we've seen at most other organizations. And then the final point is just around culture, right? The culture had to completely change to accommodate these different types of roles and jobs and leadership approaches. And he talked a bit about how they do performance management and how they reinforce that. But you could just hear him constantly hitting, this is a culture change. This is a different way of doing work. This is completely different. And people had to make those adjustments. And he gives some really good examples of that. What about for you, Danny?
Oh my gosh, like you said, there was just so much here. We originally wanted to talk to him because he is in this interesting place where he's talking about skills-based organization. At the same time, he's talking about dynamic shared ownership. I don't know if our listeners are familiar with that term, but it's basically making everybody in the organization responsible for their own selves and working toward a similar goal. He described it with basically three things. First of all, the flattening of leadership. I think they went from 12 levels down to 6 sprints. So they do 3 months of work and then readjust based on what they're doing and trying to solve problems that way. And then finally, you mentioned a little bit about leadership, but they want coaches instead of managers. And the fact that they've scrunched their layers into only 6 means that their managers are over many, many more people. And so they need coaches. They can't have somebody sort of dictating or micromanaging work. The reason that they did this is because their mission is tied directly to the customer. They went to the customer and basically said, all right, what are we trying to accomplish? And then reorganized starting with that customer. They built their organization around the customer, which again, doesn't feel like rocket science, but so many organizations are mired in kind of the momentum that they have right now that it's hard to get to that point. And they saw an opportunity to sort of move on it, and they did. The last point I want to mention is skills-based organization. It's a term that's thrown around a lot, and nobody really knows what it means, but he does. He is very clear on what it means for their particular organization. He says that a skills-based organization means that you're moving talent to work rather than work to talent. He says that it means that you have to be willing to move into a permanent upskilling mode, like you're always, always, always upskilling. And then he said that it means that there's a democratization of opportunities at scale. So it's no longer relying on somebody saying that somebody else is great. We're taking a look at the data and making opportunities available to everyone. This seriously is a great way to start off 2026. It was such a fantastic conversation, and we really encourage you to listen to it. Hey, Manuel, thanks for joining us.
Hey, everyone.
It's good to have you here. And I know it's late there for you. So thank you for staying up to talk to us today.
That's actually a perfect timing because all my kids are already sleeping. So that's a good time actually to be on a podcast. So looking forward to it.
That's awesome. As we get started, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're working and your role and some of that stuff?
Yeah, no, happy to do that. So team, first of all, excited to be with you. So my name is Manuel Smukalla, and I call myself the Global Talent Impact Skills Intelligence and System Lead at Bayer. Some of you may have heard of Bayer. Bayer is a big life science company. And I would say during my career, I spend a lot of time in HR business partner roles to basically be very close to the business, but then kind of got into this topic of skills-based organization and what skills can do, and have the pleasure since a bit more than 3 years to lead Bayer's transformation to becoming more of a skill-based organization. And I'm excited to talk about that during the podcast today. And as said, I think given my deep experience as a business partner before, I think I had a ditch into nearly all of the HR topics that you would have to deal with, when you're actually also on an operational front. Depending where you are in the HR organization, I think I've got something to offer in this podcast for you.
Very cool.
Manuel, we're so glad that you're here today. For those who may not know anything about Bayer, can you tell us a little bit about what Bayer is, where they are right now? And I know you just mentioned you've looked at a whole bunch of different people strategies and aspects from your HR business partner experience and others. So can you give us also a sense of what's prompted some of the changes that you're going to share with us today?
Yeah, no, I'd love to do that. So a little bit, first of all, let's start with Bayer. So Bayer, I guess, is a global life science company with a strong focus on healthcare and agriculture. So I think it's well known for its pharmaceutical products, also for its crop science innovation products, but also for consumer health items, including, as many of you may know, the very famous aspirin brand. We're operating, I think, a bit more than in 80 countries. And, our sales are roughly around 47 billion over the last year. So that's a bit about Bayer. Your second question was about what really triggered kind of the things that I will be talking about today. And I think that's not an easy to answer straight away, because you don't start going through such a transformation as we're just going through without having a broader context. What obviously helps a company to take a pretty radical approach if they're basically with a back to the wall. And I think it's fair to say that Bayer, because of not just the litigation issues that we are facing in the US, but also basically our profitability challenges, it helped realize the companies that we actually have to fundamentally change something, right? And I think the willingness to do something very different is just significantly higher the bigger the crisis is you're in. And I think if I reflect on our journey, over the last, I would say 5 years, that's pretty much the situation we've been in, right? And we've tried a lot of things. And I think being really confronted with pretty significant challenges actually helps companies to transform pretty radically. And I think that really helped to take the direction we're taking.
I find it really interesting because, if you're paying attention to business news at all, you've heard some of the things that Bayer is going through right now. I find it interesting that the struggle, if I can call it that Bayer has gone through and that has prompted some of these changes coincides really well with a whole bunch of other just massive changes in industry and market. AI, for example, and some of the, the skills stuff, all of that stuff is just so prevalent right now. And so I don't want to say it's a great thing, but it does seem sort of a little bit serendipitous that all of these things happened at the same time you had a real strong need for change.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Nothing happens in isolation because of the fact the company decides, that is what we're going to do. Obviously, we're operating in an environment that is at times less favorable or more favorable for us. And absolutely right. The economic situation and the geographical tensions also, is also playing the bill to us. So you're absolutely right. That actually has accelerated even the need for us to change things pretty fundamentally.
And I'd like to understand, so that's certainly the both the macro environment and then also some things that are specific to Bayer. But what was happening also with the talent that prompted some of these changes, or maybe the lack of things that were happening?
Yeah. So one of the bittersweet realizations, I think it was on the first week I was on the new job, was when I realized the manager calling me and says, well, actually, you know what, Manuel, it's good that you're on this role, but if I look in for data, for talents in our organization, do you know where I look it up? I go to LinkedIn, right? And it made me realize that LinkedIn actually knows more about our employees than we do. Well, that's a pretty big problem to have. Right? Not just because somehow, a public platform seems to know more about the skills and capabilities of your people than you actually do. But then even you're going through a transformation where the visibility of skills in agile organization, where you're trying to work in networks of team, is even more important. So that really prompted a thinking of, gosh, there's something wrong in the system. So what do we actually need to do? And obviously what came on top of this is that we simply lack the transparency of what skills do we actually have in our organization. And that is particularly true if you are in a, I would say, small company. You pretty much know what people can do and you can best use them for. If you are operating in a company like of the size of ours, with the complexity of ours, the problem is that simply the visibility of talent is a big problem because you always see the same talent, right? And the question is, how much do you really democratize opportunities for talent at scale? Is a whole different topic. And what we realized over the last couple of years, we forgot to a lot of talents in our organization simply because we killed them through our processes. And that's where we felt we have to change things pretty dramatically.
So this also coincides with your organization adopting something called dynamic shared ownership, which I guess Harvard Business Management calls the biggest management experiment of all time. So, I mean, it's great that it's awesome, but can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so in very short terms, when you hear dynamic shared ownership, I think it comprises primarily three things. Number one is we're moving from a traditional hierarchical organization into a network of teams, right? So just in a couple of numbers, we started like 3 years ago with having 13 management layers from the top to the bottom. In today's world, we have 6, right? So we basically halved it, right?
You've blended.
The second thing that is changing is that we're actually working in 90-day cycles. So we're organizing and setting up teams in 90-day cycle and setting up outcomes on a 90-day cycle. After those 90 days, we do a retrospective and reflect what did we learn and what do we have to improve in our next cycle, right? And we even stop work that, may not have led to the outcome that we wanted to lead it to. But we basically want to redesign work in more agile and quick cycles, right? That's the second thing of dynamic shared owner thing. And then the third thing of dynamic shared ownership is pretty much the change in the way on how we think about leadership. So you can imagine in an operating model where the decision is much more decentralized, where we have basically got rid of all the steering committees that we had before, you need a leadership where it's more that leaders are leading from the back and are more acting as a coach than rather they are controlling their people. Even to an extent that they will even not know in detail what exactly your people are working on. They just know what are the outcomes and how do I steer the team to the outcomes. But simply because of the setup on the way how we've set it up, for a leader, it's impossible to do a command and control system simply of the amount of people that are reporting to him and her. So it's a very different way of leadership from, if you look at it, what you may know from a traditional hierarchical organization, where the boss is, so to say, a pretty important element of the piece. In our world, it's more the networks of teams that we are orchestrating, and the role of a leader is to make sure that we're setting the right outcomes and set up the right teams, but not really to manage, control, or even make decisions, because the decisions are made in those network of teams. So that, in very short terms, 3 things I think that characterize dynamic shared ownership.
So I have so many questions with respect to this, because in theory, it sounds marvelous. In sort of execution, I can see it being really, really disruptive, especially to an older organization that had a pretty hierarchical structure. So I'm wondering a couple of things. The first one is, how did it roll out? Who dreamt it up and who had ownership of making sure that it worked?
Yeah, so what we used a lot actually as we introduced it, and don't forget, I mean, we're on this journey now for 2 years. Right. So the way how we started introducing it, we basically first started go where the energy is. So not, rolling it out to everybody first. We started with functions where there was interest. And we coupled this with so-called dynamic shared ownership coaches, which are, so to say, our front line in teaching those networks of teams how they operate in 90 days. So how do they set outcomes? How do they hold each other accountable in those teams? And how are they driving progress, right? Because if you haven't worked in such an environment, that's nothing that per se you are aware of on how to do it. What we also learned is that obviously the first 90 days when you're doing this, there are a lot of things that aren't going very well. But what you realize, the more you do it, the better you get at it. And I think that's a crack to it, that you have to be patient in the way on how you approach it, and also have to be in a willingness. There needs to be a willingness of, so to say, unlearn previous things that in a traditional management organization was very favorable to have.
Why? How did people actually do this, right? It's one thing to say, okay, starting on January, 8th, new year, new you, new bear, we're going to do things differently. But what was kind of involved in actually making folks have the right incentives to do this and motivations and then the structure and process underneath to make the shift?
Yeah. One of our constant beliefs in this is that, the networks of teams that we're setting up, they need to have a mission, and the mission obviously needs to solve a customer problem. Right? Because we're not doing this on our own, right? If you think about the traditional hierarchical organization, what happens is that from the top to the bottom, you actually often lose the proximity to your customer. So the first thing we did, we reorganized our organization by starting with a customer and basically build the organization around the customer, which is very different, right? So the networks of teams were basically built around the problems that our customers have. And the mission that those teams set up, what is the problem of our customers that we're trying to solve? And by having that, those missions, you're basically clear about what you're trying to solve. That's about how you go about it. And obviously, if you do such a radical thing, it's not that you suddenly on day one tell the entire organization, now you set up a network of teams and you're going to work in 90 days. The way how you do this is that you start with early adopters, and those early adopters tell about what they learned. They talk about their success stories, but they also talk about their failures. And what you do by actually doing this and also showcase some of the achievement that those teams have achieved, you create appetite for other teams to kind of come on board. right? So what initially started with a couple of teams has 2 years down the road been rolled out to the entire company. That does not mean that in 2 years, everybody is working and already knows really well on how this is working, because you can imagine such an operating model works a little bit better in functions where you already have pretty project-oriented work, like IT, R&D. For organizations like, I don't know, maybe a product supply organization that per se requires more of a process-oriented way on how to do things, they might need a little bit more time to think about how they implement such a system within their environment. Fair to say that it's easier for some functions that were already a bit more operating in that way compared to other functions where this is much more of a change.
Thank you for that. That's super helpful for kind of envisioning how this all works. I want to talk about a little bit more about the skills-based talent management and what that looks like and why you made that shift, and kind of how does this fit into that overall dynamic shared ownership?
So one of the key principles of dynamic shared ownership, if you want to operate in 90-day cycles, what you kind of have to do, you have to deploy your talent on the most critical missions. In order to do that, you need to have what we internally call a principle of talent flow. Now, in a traditional organization, talent flow often is limited to whom are you reporting to, how many resources does that person have, and so on, right? So talent flow is a key principle in order to let DSO fly. Now, how does the skills piece come in? As you can imagine, if you want to enable talent flow beyond a traditional silo that you're operating in, the first problem that you need to solve for is that you need to create skill visibility. What are people actually capable of doing? Very simple, right? That is the minimum you want to start with, right? And I told you about my experience when I started on the job, where somebody said actually LinkedIn knows more about that, our people, than actually we do. So think about you're setting up those networks of teams and you don't even know what your people are doing. So hence, our first part of the journey on our skills journey was, we need to have visibility on the skills that everybody has in order to do a better job of democratizing opportunities to people that we may not have on our radar. Okay, so that was the first part of the skill story, right? To create the visibility. What it then evolved to, basically 2 years down the road, is that we launched an entire marketplace which kind of democratizes opportunities in a way at scale, because it's taking away that barrier from previous silos that was primarily in which function are you working, which career level are you on, and which location you are, much more around organizing the opportunities basically linked to your skills and what you are capable of. That does not mean that you are not doing a job anymore, but it is a different way of making you aware of opportunities that previously you may even have not seen, simply because you were operating in the silo that you were. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Maybe could we dive just a little bit deeper into how you made those skills visible initially?
If you're a senior people leader, you know the hard part isn't finding ideas. It's deciding which ones are worth acting on. That's why Red Thread created Summit 2026. It's not a conference, it's a small, invitation-only working retreat. On June 23rd, senior HR leaders will gather in Snowbird, Utah for 3 days of guided, peer-driven work grounded in research. No keynotes, no vendor pitches, no passive audiences. Leaders will leave having strengthened people strategies they've been grappling with for years, with clearer direction on what to change, what to stop, and what to double down on. If you want to be part of that conversation, learn more and request an invitation over at redthreadresearch.com.
So our first step basically was that we created employee profiles where we asked people to maintain their skills. So in easy terms, nothing else than what you are doing on LinkedIn, right? So what are the skills that are describing you? And we did run workshops even to employees on how to set up a good skill profile on a platform. And that's the way how we started to get visibility on the skills of our employees.
So a lot of organizations right now, we run workshops on this and have written extensively on this idea of skills ontologies and skills taxonomies. And it seems like you took maybe a simpler approach, which was basically saying, all right, guys, here's a skills profile and here's how you fill it out. And we're going to use that data to then give you opportunities for stuff in the organization.
Exactly. That was our first step. And again, as you will hear me talk about, a skills journey is a journey for a good reason. Right? And you need to start somewhere, and you need to know what problem you are trying to solve. So don't start with, I'm trying to solve 4 problems at once, and that's why I'm shooting out this entire ecosystem to you, right? So make sure what problem are you trying to solve. And the first problem that we were trying to solve was the skill visibility topic, right? And then came the other problems on top, which we then per step by step, basically introduced to our ecosystem that we are enriching over time.
So let me ask a question about the talent marketplace too, because when people put those into place, a lot of times they're using them for development purposes or some other reasons. But it feels like, kind of from what you've said, you are using it or initially put it in place to democratize the opportunities to develop and learn. So you're basically taking everybody out of like the traditional, like if your manager likes you, you get promoted, and basically saying, hey, if you can do this job and if you have a desire to do this job, then you have the opportunity to go after this piece of work.
So this is one of the crux that I think an organization has to embrace in this concept. If you are doing what we are doing, and a skill-based organization, I think, has 3 main pillars. Number 1 is you want to move talent to work rather than work to talent. And that is basically the other way around, like you normally do that, right? You want to move talent to work rather than work to talent. The second paradigm is that you actually have to be willing to go into a permanent re- and upskilling in a way, right? That's the second important element of a skill-based organization, right? Permanent re- and upskilling. And then the third one is what you just mentioned. That's the democratization of opportunities at scale. Now, what I think is the crux in many organizations is you have now a platform, but you have those managers who don't let their people go. So then the problem starts right away. So before you even think about that, you actually have to be very clear about what sort of leadership do you want to have and what is supporting your people strategy before you launch such a platform. Like we launched our platform basically, and you can see why DSO was so important for us to make this platform work. We launched this platform with the slogan, be empowered, be Bayer. And rather than, and even if you are applying or if you're raising interest in a project opportunity on the platform, you per se don't have to ask for a permission via your line manager. Idealistically, you inform him. That's what I would do. But it's not that there is a workflow triggered and the manager then approves it, because what the incidence of this is, you to full extent own the work that you are owning, and it's up to you to decide what capacity you have and where you bring yourself, right? Now, to also be fair, right, we have this concept of fixed, flex work, and completely agile work. So, meaning fixed work, you traditionally do one job, right? And that's what you do, right? The classical operator in front of a machine. But in many times, what I think all of us are doing these days is that we operate in a flex environment. We kind of do our job, but on top of the job, there are 3 other projects. And those projects may not necessarily directly relate to the work, often they do. And that's exactly what we're trying to cultivate in terms of a culture. This culture of look at your job as a flexed job, where you flex time to things that you love to do and things where you can create a great impact with the skills you have. And then obviously there are also the consultant jobs where you are changing every 90 days. That also exists, where it's not just a flex, but it's a full hybrid or fully mobile job. Yeah.
So when you think about the flex jobs and kind of the proportion that's spent on your real job, if you will, or your fixed job, what is that? Is there an ideal amount? So it's like 60% on your core job and then 40% on your flex, or how do you give people guidance there?
So look, because our realities are so different, we are, at least globally, not giving a guidance, because we feel whatever guidance we would be giving would not make, we wouldn't meet necessarily the reality. But also to be true is, as we are also learning dynamic shared ownership, we also don't know it ourselves, right? So I think that's the reality as well. If we would know and say, it's kind of 60-40, but we actually also don't know it ourselves because it's highly contextual. What obviously we're asking for is a culture of letting people go and letting people own their career. And to let people own their career also takes responsibility from the employee, because if I'm signing up for a project opportunity, I at the end of the day have to make sure that I deliver, and there's a time and commitment also related to this. So I have to reflect on this on my own before I'm actually, raising my hand. And that is a very different way of how you think about your work, because at the end of the day, you're self-responsible in a way, or more self-responsible in terms of what you are driving.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple of times, it's in the name, right? Let's see what it is. Dynamic shared ownership. Everybody's sharing ownership of the things. It sounds like you're letting adults be adults, which is something that many organizations don't do well. And then holding them responsible for that. I don't want to say carrot and stick, but I'm really interested in how you determine success on these projects and how that affects a person's career.
Excellent question. So I think the success of those networks of teams is pretty much at the beginning of a 90-day cycle, you're setting yourself outcomes as a team, outcomes that you commit to as a team, right? And after those 90 days, you also sit together with the same members and review on, okay, let's look at the outcomes we've set ourselves. What did we achieve and what did we not achieve, and why not? And as you do this and get better on this, what you suddenly realize is that there is a peer pressure and a peer component coming into this, because often you are dependent on what your peers on this team are delivering, because often it's not that you're alone can solve a topic. You are dependent on others to deliver as well. Right? That's why you have this team. If the work is, you could do it on your own, you don't need a team for that, right? So often you're depending on others. And as you do this very systematically, what you then realize is that obviously what previously might have been your boss is suddenly your peer who is giving you feedback on, look, we could have been better on this, or this didn't go as we wanted, or this was excellent. So in that kind of way of operating, that's kind of fitting in. Now, how you determine success in this is, I think, have you achieved the outcomes that you have set yourself? Now, the question on the career that you asked, this is a super valid question that we are trying to get our heads around, because this really isn't an easy one, right? Because I think if you have listened to some of the podcasts from Squiggly Career from Helen Tupper, she talks a lot about this legacy of the ladder and the legacy of the corporate ladder, which kind of is very stuck in big corporations like ours, but also in many, which is kind of the assumption that you are climbing a hierarchy level and that's the way how you advance. And you actually have to become a people leader in order to advance, right? In many corporate organizations, that's the corporate ladder that you are jumping. Now, in a system like ours, this corporate ladder doesn't work anymore, at least not in the traditional way, because simply there are not so many ladders. And also, the roles that you have underneath are pretty much different, right? It's not the ladder that is necessary to. You still have a ladder, right? So don't get me wrong, but it's not the ladder primarily determining on how you advance. It's primarily also the impact and the skills that you apply that are much more important in that networks of teams. So what you actually have to do, you have to rethink career as such, like you have to rethink the way how you do performance management in such a system, like you have to rethink the way how you go about feedback, because feedback in such a model is super crucial. Otherwise, it is not working. So what I want to say with that is moving to such a system requires an HR professional like myself to take a step back and kind of rethink our entire ecosystem, because the system that we had before worked for a corporate organization that is built on hierarchies. It does not necessarily so much support this new way of basically organizing teams.
This is a super interesting conversation. We want to go to the break and do a quick lightning round to get to know you a little bit. But this is a really interesting conversation to both Stacia and I. We've been talking about this for like 5 years. Like, I love the way that you put it, bringing the people to the work, not the work to the people. We say, organizing around the work, not around the people, but the same idea. And it's interesting to me, this thing that I'm not sure I've ever thought of before, the importance of skills to this type of paradigm shift, right? So if you don't have skills and or a way to judge somebody's reputation on how they can do certain work, something like this doesn't necessarily work well. And so I think we want to pick that back up again and talk about maybe some of the ways that you're structuring that in the organization. But that was sort of an aha to me, like this paradigm of moving toward organizing people around the work. You really do need skills or strong reputation signals in order to do something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
With that, let's move to some lighthearted questions before we get back into some of the structure. This is so interesting to us. There aren't many organizations that have taken a traditional ladder type structure and turned it into something like this, as I'm sure you're aware. And so the fact that you're 2 years down the road and can talk about it is fascinating. Okay, let's do lightning round. 3 questions to get to know you just a little bit better. The first one is, how would you describe yourself in 3 words?
Oh gosh, I think that would be, pretty energetic, per se positive, and coffee addicted. That would be the 3 words.
Do those all go together?
I think, well, most likely, yeah.
All right, question number 2 is, what would you be terrible at?
Oh my God, yeah, I think the worst job that I ever had. So when I started at Bayer, I started as a trainee. And as a trainee, you have to go to a chemical site. So what happened, because I didn't have any education to actually do something, I basically was there doing nothing. Like doing nothing. There's nothing worse than you could do than doing nothing. So I did 4 weeks, nothing. And I think what I realized after those 4 weeks, gosh, I was so glad to be back at work. So if you give me something where my primary job would be to do not a lot, oh my God, I would be really bad at it. I was really bad at doing nothing. And even the one thing that I was supposed to do once a day, I was even messing it up. Yeah. So
my dad told me once, right after he retired, that it was the most exhausting job he'd ever had. Like, being retired is just awful because there's not, like, kind of like you're saying. Like,
oh gosh, yeah.
Get things done. Last question. This one's a little bit more about Bayer, but I'm interested, kind of based on the last 5 years. What do you think your biggest strengths and weaknesses are? What do you think Bayer's biggest strengths and weaknesses are?
Oh, I guess let's start with the strength. I think definitely the drive for science and the drive for making life better. That is something that really fascinated me since the beginning I am with this company. And with that goes also a willingness to kind of do things that nobody does, like DSO, right? Like doing something radically different, right? I think that's also unique to Bayer. I think what is a little bit of our weakness, and I guess that is true for many big corporations, is that as we work in three distinct businesses, you would expect a lot of movement, within those businesses and talent moves. I think it's fair to say that we're still not where we want to be, even with DSO, where talent flow is I think we traditionally haven't been really good at really using that to our advantage in a way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So Manuel, thank you for sharing that. As our listeners know, I am our performance management person around here. And so I'm always asking, how do we measure people? How do we measure performance? And, this is a totally different approach. So I'd love to hear just a bit about how you all are handling performance management.
Yeah, that's a good question. And as I indicated before, you kind of have to rethink the traditional performance management, where you kind of sit at the beginning of the year, talk through, okay, what do you want to have achieved till the end of the year, and then write it down. I think that doesn't work in a system like that. So what normally happens is that you basically set yourself outcomes, goals in 90 days, and you do this in a team setting, right? And those teams you agree upon within the team, right? And those you basically then agree upon, and the persons who are assessing you is not necessarily your manager, because your manager may even not be part of the team, but it's the people that are on this team, right? It's the work lead of that team, but also the peers on your team. And that's what we do, right? And that you can imagine, if you have in a year, you have 4 90-day cycles, sums up to quite some data. But it requires you to kind of do this outcome setting every 90 days, review what you have achieved, and then think, how you redo this, or whether you stop even an activity or a team and redo it. So that's the way how I think I would reflect on the way how we do performance management.
Just to clarify, so let's say you're in one of those flex jobs, because I'm super interested by this. Would you get feedback from both kind of your core job and then whatever other projects that you were working on?
Exactly. So what you would have in that case is that you would most likely have, for your flex piece, you would be assigned to projects, right? And in this project, you're working for a work lead. And that work lead may have a perception on how well you did on the outcomes that you have committed to, right? And that's where you get your feedback. Now, on your more permanent job, I think you will get primarily feedback from most likely your home manager, who is kind of overseeing that area, who may have a say, but it may also be not your home manager, so your direct manager, but also maybe another team with whom you are closely working on those elements. So we're trying to put more emphasis on making it more objective by adding other sources in terms of feedback that go beyond your traditional home or work manager.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So let's deep dive managers a little bit. I'm imagining that leadership in this type of organization is pretty different than leadership in a more traditional ladder type of organization. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and maybe what pathing looks like as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're kind of extending the traditional management in the way how we're thriving leadership. So we call the way how we're thinking about leadership our so-called VACC model. So we look at leaders that act as visionaries who engage with their teams to shape their missions, right? So they're really setting the vision of where this is going. We're also looking at, and now it comes with the architects, so who help teams reimagine how they create value in a way, right? So that's the co-creation piece. And then it's the catalyst, so the C, where you foster empowerment and teamwork across the networks, right? So that's really taking yourself out as a manager and really fostering the team to make the decisions. And then last but not least, which I think is also a pretty important one, is the coach, who helps the team to work in rapid cycles and also to help the team in case they get stuck. So with those 4 principles, which we call VAC, visionary, architect, catalyst, and coach, we're kind of reimagining the way on how we think about leadership. And as I said before, approaching a leadership principle like this does require leaders who are maybe born and who have experienced a traditional way of leadership a significant amount of unlearning, right? Because it's less about you as a leader setting the objectives in a way and the outcomes. It's more about you're setting the vision, but the real objectives and the outcomes are set on a team level. And that is not, you may even not be directly involved into that activity, which requires, if you are used to a very different way from a traditional organization, to do a lot of unlearning, which you can imagine is a big change management effort.
Yeah. My next question was going to be, are you able to take the leaders that you have and turn them into the leaders that you need? Or have you had to do a lot of changing of the guard?
So we did the first, right?
Okay.
And we offered our leaders, because that is a journey, right? And I think to this journey also, people also need to be vulnerable, and because nobody was born as a VAC leader per se, right? Even in a system like Bayer used to be, our managers were taught in a very different manner. So suddenly, in this new system, basically they are asked to more lead from the back, which is a significant change. So basically what we're doing is we're not just offering opportunities to reflect leaders on their behaviors in a constant manner. Obviously, we're also helping them to connect with each other. Because believe me one thing, if you're exchanging with people who suddenly are in a similar situation like you, who are suddenly leading teams of 50 people, where it's simply impossible to understand what each and everybody on this team is doing, to then reimagine the way how you can be an impactful leader in such a setup helps you if you exchange with others who are in a similar situation. And that's exactly what we do. And again, also here we're having offerings to help leaders to get equipped for such a new way of leading teams.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you're taking the leaders you have and trying to figure it out. It jives with the whole idea that everybody's responsible for their own selves. And so the leader has less of that kind of thing to do. I'm interested also in the culture of how you made that shift, right? So you changed your leaders, and that was a big deal. You also had to change the employee body. And most employees are conditioned, whether we like it or not, from the time they are very small, to look toward leadership for direction and, in some cases, spoon feeding. And what you basically said is, no, y'all have to grow up and be responsible for yourselves. How did you do that?
First of all, accept that it is a process. And also we also know from cultural research that there are quite significant differences across cultures, right? There are cultures where there is more I think it's called power distance, where the power distance is much higher, where it's even expected from a leader to tell a team which direction we're taking. Now, that doesn't mean that in a new setup you don't have other leaders. Even if it's in a setup like that, you will have work team leaders that are kind of stepping in what most likely previously did the direct leader. So you will still have leaders who are managing those networks of teams, but it may not be your direct boss. And so in a way, you're having sub-teams and work team leaders who are taking the role of the leader that you may have had traditionally. But that leader may change over time much more often than you're used to, right? And again, it takes time. It takes willingness to unlearn. And it takes also vulnerability to kind of accept that you won't be that sort of a leader from day one on. And you will have to constantly reflect on, okay, where I am, what do I need to do more, and what do I need to do less? But the setup per se makes it very difficult for somebody who wants to do micromanagement. The setup itself makes it nearly impossible to do it. Right? So in a way, you are forced to reinvent yourself, and that is not comfortable to start with, right? I mean, let's also be honest, right? It's not, but you've consciously been selected for such a role, right? So it was also a conscious decision to do that, but then realizing what that really means for you, how you have to take yourself back to understand, so what is my role now, is also not the easiest process. So, yes, and we're in the middle of that, and yeah.
Interesting. You've mentioned a lot of the change that employees have had to make as a result of this, but I'm interested in what their overall response or reaction has been. Like, what have they thought about this change?
I would say that's super hard to really answer in general, right? Because you can imagine that it's a very fundamental shift. And what happens if you do a fundamental shift? It's normally not that you get that people directly jump on it and they really like it, because it takes time to embrace such a model. And also the reality, I think, is dependent on where you are, pretty different. So I would have a hard time to really give a rather generic answer on this. I think it really depends on where you are and how much the area that you're working in has already embraced the new ways of working, or even, there may even be work kind of they've put DSO kind of on it, but the way how they operate is more like the traditional way. That also will most likely exist, right? So that's why I find it really hard to answer that question, because it's a fundamental change and it's to be expected that it will take time to embrace it.
So we've talked about quite a few changes. We've talked about DSO. We've talked about making everybody responsible, the change in leadership, skills. Like, there's been a lot of shift in your organization. I'd love to understand kind of where you are with understanding the outcomes. Like, has it been overall?
You mean the way how we said?
Yeah. So I'm interested in business outcomes. You did this to solve some challenges that you had, and I want to know if you did it or if you're in the process of doing it.
So I think like with every new operating model, at the end of the day, I think the financials will decide and the market will decide whether such a model will survive or not, right? I think it's as simple as that, right? At the end of the day, the company will have to deliver against things that we're telling our stakeholders, right? If we're not delivering what we're telling our stakeholders, we lose the credibility. So at the end of the day, I think the whole thing comes down to how credible and how are we actually delivering financially to the market, right? And that will make it or break it in a way, right? So I look at this very simplistically, right? Because I think many organizations experience moments of centralization and decentralization. It's clear that we're now, at least with DSO, very much in a decentralized mode. But also there are phases, right? And often the market determines on what actually your reality tomorrow will be. And I think that is to a certain extent also true for us.
Manuel, this has been an incredibly interesting conversation. We could go on forever, but we're going to run out of time very soon. And I want to get to just some final wrap-up questions for you. For organizations that are going to try this biggest business experiment ever, what a piece of advice do you have for them?
So my first advice would be, as I said, when I was talking about our skills journey, it all starts with the question of what problem are you trying to solve? Are you clear about what problem are you trying to solve? It sounds like a very simple question, but if you are not clear about what problem you are trying to solve, think about, whether you really want to do it, right? And that does not mean that you have to know everything as you start on the journey. I didn't know a lot of the things that were coming on the journey, believe me, right? But then you figure out the next problem that you actually want to solve, and then you jump on this problem, right? And that is then your journey. So my advice would be, come on the journey, but be clear about the problem that you're trying to solve initially. Rest assured, there will be more problems that you will be trying to solve as you embark on this journey. Then, over time, that would be my biggest advice.
We would agree with that. We run a skills workshop where people develop a skills strategy, and the hardest part, everybody tells us that the very hardest part of that is defining your purpose. Why are you doing this thing? Yeah.
So we've asked you about how you got started to some extent and that piece of advice. Can you tell us just real quickly what you want to drive towards next?
Oh, yeah. So I think when we talk about our skills strategy, I think skills alone is not a strategy, right? And skills basically becomes a reality by the use cases that you put to them. We've basically, if you look at what we've done with the launch of our talent marketplace, we've applied it with talent acquisition. We've applied it with, I would say, internal mobility in the way how we post projects, right? In the way how we democratize opportunities. We're doing it in talent development with mentorships, people to connect with, and so on. And we've also connected it to learning, right? These are our classical use cases. A use case that we're currently looking into, how does a career progression model, and we talked about the way, what does a career look like in such a new operating model? That's a use case that we're currently looking at intensively, and the way, how are we going about that? So that's certainly a nut that we're trying to crack next.
I love that. Final question for you. We ask this question to everybody that comes onto our podcast, and that question is, why do you do the work that you do?
So look, when I actually started this, it started as a project. And what I love about what I'm doing is that I feel like I'm bringing a magical triangle together. And the magical triangle is people, skills, and technology. And if those three things you bring together in a meaningful manner, and you always start with the people first, if you bring that together, people, skills, and technology in a meaningful manner, I guess there is nothing more exciting than to contribute to something like that. That's at least my perception. And I feel like, having had the pleasure to drive this transformation so far, seeing this triangle move and become much more impactful over time with the various use cases that we've talked about in today's podcast is something that I'm super excited about.
Manuel, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks to you. That was great.
Thank you, Manuel.
Thanks for listening. If this podcast got you thinking differently about how work happens, that's what we're here for. We dig into these topics every week in our research and in the Red Thread community. The Red Thread community is a place where people, leaders, and practitioners come together to compare notes, share what's working, and maybe challenge those things that aren't working so well. You can join for free at redthreadresearch.com/membership. Or if you or your organization are ready to go deeper, take a look at our professional and our enterprise memberships. For professional tier, for listeners, you can use the promotional code STORIES, STORIES, for a 10% discount. And if you're a tech provider trying to make sense of this space, our tech consortium is where smart vendors are coming together to learn from each other and from the market. You'll find everything at redthreadresearch.com. I'm Danny Johnson. Thanks for listening and for caring about making work better.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the Red Thread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.